Hey, it's 4.5, Step 1, Poetry Beyond Structure and Form. Let's tackle the second half of the packet. The lesson objective for this lesson is students will be able to analyze a poem using the Understanding Poetry questions. The Understanding Poetry questions are linked in Schoology, and they are in your packet. Okay, so there are at least two different places where you can access them, and I'll be referring to them throughout the slideshow. In the slideshow, they will be shown by being in blue text. So if it's blue text on the screen, that means that's information that is in Understanding Poetry questions. So you've already got that text in your packet. Don't feel like you need to copy it down again. So here is information from the Understanding Poetry packet. You do not need to write that down again. All right? But taking some notes for 4.5, you'll want to write down some other things that help you better understand whatever term it is we're working on. And if you take a look at the beginning here, we're looking at central tension. What is the central tension in a poem? Central tension is basically the conflict in a poem. When we analyze narratives like short stories and prose, that is maybe fiction or prose, other than nonfiction, we often look for the conflict towards the beginning of the text. Sometimes there is an inciting event, right, where something happens, a problem arises that the characters have to deal with, or the protagonist has to deal with, respond to in some way. When we're reading poetry, we just don't have as much text, and so oftentimes we don't have a complete narrative. We don't have a full story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so the conflict in poetry is different than looking for that inciting event and, how the protagonist has to struggle with it. And so instead we look for something called a central tension. And it's really when you have two opposing forces acting against each other. And you can find these in any poem. And you just have to, get used to looking for them. So I'm going to use the poem October by Robert Frost that we spent a lot of time working on in terms of form and structure in the first half of the packet as we work through these Understanding Poetry questions. If you were to read the first few lines of October, "O hushed October morning mild, thy leaves have ripened to the fall, tomorrow's wind, if it be wild, should waste them all," you start to already see some opposing forces. And those opposing forces are between the leaves and the wind. So the leaves have ripened to the fall, but if the wind is wild tomorrow, they'll be wasted. So there is an opposition there between leaves and wind. Also the crows. We can see this in starting in line 5, the crows above the forest call, tomorrow they may form and go. So the crows are gathering is working against this idea that they may leave. They're going to get together, but that's going to mean that they're then going to go and migrate. So we have some opposition working right there. How can we put this together to say what the central tension of the poem is? I've got one more here, I guess. The clustered fruit of the grapes at the very end is set up against the frost that is encroaching. It's coming, it's burning the leaves, it's going to destroy the fruit. All right, so we might say that the central tension in October is the wasting of fall and the desire to prolong the good versus the coming of the bad, the winter. All right, let's move on to the next. Speaker and tone. When we read October, we determined through SCASI who the characters were, and we talked about the speaker as a character. These are some questions you can ask about the speaker to determine more about the voice. These are listed already in your Understanding Poetry questions, so you don't have to write them down. Instead, jot down this, the fact that the voice is key when we're analyzing speaker and tone. We want to try to find the lines where you feel like you can really hear the attitude, the way the speaker feels behind the words. So the tone or attitude is crucial when we are looking at the voice and speaker and tone. In October, we found out as we looked at who the characters were that the speaker is asking October to slow down. The speaker doesn't want fall to leave and winter to begin. And I think the next tip is to look for some specific words that show the voice of the speaker, or for where there are some changes in tone and attitude. So when we look more closely at this speaker who is petitioning October to stay, we start looking at some different attitudes the speaker has. And I think the first one that we notice is that the speaker is really trying to coax the month into staying through flattery by giving the month, as if it were a person, some compliments. Oh, hushed October morning mild is repeated, and this complimentary phrase creates a coaxing feeling that the speaker is trying to convince October to stay through flattery. There's the same attitude continues, the same tone or attitude continues with the listing of all of the different ways that October could act or have power. And it becomes almost ingratiating here as the speaker lists begin, make, beguile, release, twice, and then retard, enchant. These are all commanding verbs in that the speaker is commanding October. That's the type of sentence structure that we have. But the listing of them one after the other starts to make it feel as if October has limitless control and power. And in that way, again, we're sort of coaxing and ingratiating October. Then the tone changes really in line 17 with slow. We have that exclamation mark, right? There's more of a command here, but now it's more pleading, like, for the great sake, which is reminiscent of for heaven's sake or for God's sake, as if there were some true urgency behind the words that October needs to slow down, or things will really be ruined. The fruit of the grapes will be no more. When we move on to setting and atmosphere, we're really talking more about mood than tone. And I think this is a good thing to jot down. It is also in a document that is linked in the Understanding Poetry document on Schoology, but it's not part of the Understanding Poetry questions. Atmosphere, the definition of it, well, it refers to the feeling, emotion, or mood a writer conveys to a reader through the description of setting and objects. Atmosphere mainly emerges through description rather than action. It's not what people do necessarily that creates an atmosphere, but the settings and environments that stage what they do. So mood is often used synonymously with atmosphere, although in a certain way it's bigger than just atmosphere. And I'll come back to that at the end of the video. But as far as atmosphere goes, atmosphere is really the feeling that's created through the description and of setting and the things that are being described in the piece. We talked a lot about setting an atmosphere when we read Men We Reaped, and so here's an example in Jesmond Ward's Men We Reaped. The atmosphere is often ambivalent, feeling two ways at the same time, and contrasting, like oppressive and comforting, as she describes the oppressive heat and outward signs of poverty, while at the same time describing the places of community and togetherness. So, good words to describe the atmosphere of that book: oppressive and comforting. Think about some words that would describe the atmosphere of October. What do you think? These are questions from the Understanding Poetry document. When we're analyzing setting and atmosphere, we're really looking at the place and the feelings created through the description of that place. We tackled it a little bit when we did SCASI, because the first S in SCASI is setting. As we talked about how it's an October morning in lines 1 and 7, noon in line 13, and then sunset in line 16. We talked about the place and that it's a forest with leaves falling, grapes are growing. So those are all very sort of literal places in and times having to do with where the poem takes place. When we get to atmosphere, it's more about the feelings that are created based on how the setting is described. So here's what I came up with, and I don't know, what do you think about this? I said for one of the moods that's created, or one of the atmospheres that's created, dreamy and slow motion. Oh, hushed October morning mild connects with that, supports that assertion, I think. This slow motion description of releasing one leaf only at break of day and then waiting until noon to release a second leaf. And then slowing down the sun with mist and enchanting the land with purple. It creates this kind of dreamy, slow motion feeling. But then there's this other side too, I think, in the poem where we have kind of a panicky feeling created. I don't know, maybe that's more tone than mood. These things do interlap and work together sometimes, and sometimes it can be tricky to delineate the two. If you're ever confused about whether it's tone or mood or atmosphere, use the word feeling, okay? And then you bypass that concern. I think it's more important, and IB says that they think it's more important, that you're able to identify the particular feeling more than the fact that you're able to identify what is tone and what is mood. So be precise in looking at the feelings that are created, and don't worry as much about the labels. Of course, the labels can help too, and sometimes I think that IB says one thing, but doesn't always mean it either. So we want to make sure that we understand the differences too. At any rate, I think there's a panicky feeling created as well with some of these lines about how things are changing and it's about to be lost, and we want to slow it down right now. All right. There's a link in Schoology for more on atmosphere. It's in the Understanding Poetry document, and you'll see the link right in there. And it has a list of a bunch of good words you can use when you're looking at atmosphere. Diction is the next thing, and really what we're looking at when we are looking at diction are words that stand out. Either they are just really extraordinary words, or they're ordinary words used in extraordinary ways. I think the key words in this poem that we could look at as being extraordinarily used are ripened in line 2. That word is especially interesting because it's used to describe leaves. And typically we do not describe leaves as being ripened. We describe fruit as being ripened. And so that's an interesting choice for Frost to describe the leaves this way. Leaves typically change color in October in New England and in places like Minnesota. And they are changing color because they're dying, and eventually they'll be released by the tree, and then they will turn into dust and dirt and will no more, won't work for the tree in the same way. And so the fact that the leaves are in this poem described as ripened provides a different connotation. Connotation is the feeling that's created by a certain word. Denotation is the direct definition of a word, what the word means. There's nothing wrong with looking up words in the dictionary when you're analyzing poetry. I do it all the time. Now, when you get your poem in May, or whatever text they're going to have you analyze, you won't have the luxury of looking up words. However, they will usually give you a couple of definitions, and you can use those as you make sense of the poem. So denotation and connotation are both very important when it comes to poetry, and the connotation of ripened makes the leaves feel like there's something that they are something that can be used and even enjoyed or savored, much like a fruit that has ripened can be enjoyed and savored. And the idea of these leaves being wasted in line 4 is similar to how you might waste ripened fruit. If it isn't used soon enough, it goes to waste because it rots and therefore is no longer edible. The use of describing the leaves as ripened creates the feeling that the leaves serve some purpose right now, but soon will be discarded and no longer serve a purpose. In lines 10 and 11, we have the word beguile, which is an interesting word. I think that you could work with in the same way that I just explained ripened and waste. And then the word enchant, too, in line 16, I think. The title is good to look at when we're analyzing diction and poetry. And, of course, October is an obvious title for this poem since the poet is speaking, or excuse me, the speaker is speaking directly to the month, as it is an apostrophe where the speaker is acting as if the month were an animate being. Another thing to look at is comparative imagery, sensory details, and illusions. How do we deal with those? Well, they're separated here into comparative imagery and sensory details because there's really two kinds of imagery that we want to think about. There's one that deals with the figurative, deals with things that are not literal, but that are being compared to something else, and so are a figurative kind of comparison. And we would have that in line 2 with leaves have ripened to the fall. The leaves are being compared in oblique sense to fruit ripening. When I separate sensory details from comparative imagery, I've done that because these are more literal details where one or more of the 5 senses is evoked. Something like visual, auditory, tactile, smell, taste. Those senses are evoked through literal descriptions of these details. And some examples then are in purple. The crows above the forest call, retard the sun with gentle mist. These are, the first example is auditory imagery. The second is visual imagery. And in the auditory imagery, we can hear the crows calling. In the visual, we can see it. Now, it's not enough just to label it and say, in this image, we can really hear the crows. The next step is to decide what is the effect of hearing the crows call above the forest. And, you have to determine that on your own. That's when you make those leaps to evaluative and interpretive conclusions that you then have to support. Sorry about that. I had to go do my lunch duty, opening the door for you guys. So what were we talking about? What's the difference between tone and mood? Is that where we're at? The last thing was sound. Nope. I think we got to talk about some of these other things. My slide's not in the right spot. All right. So we were talking about comparative imagery versus sensory details. And then the third one under this box is illusions. Illusions are references to well-known things, either from art or pop culture. In the poem that you are going to be analyzing for the summative assessment, there is an allusion to Emily Dickinson's Hope is the Thing with feathers. And it is in lines 48 through 49. Hope is the thing. And it's in italics, too, as if the author is reminding us that this is from another literary work. Hope was always the thing is the next line in lines 49. So it comes from this poem, this very famous poem from the 19th century by American poet Emily Dickinson. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never, in extremity, it asked a crumb of me. And so a lot of people have attributed Emily Dickinson with sort of hitting the nail on the head here with describing hope, that, comparing it to a bird. Without really calling it a bird, it's a little bit more elusive than that, but it's something that flies, it never stops, it sings, and doesn't ask anything else. All right, sound in poetry. Well, there's 3 words you should know the definition of. One is alliteration, and that's just when words begin with the same sound and are placed close together. Assonance is the repetition of the same or similar vowel sounds within words, phrases, or sentences. And then onomatopoeia, words that sound like what they describe. In our poem, you'll have to see if you can find some examples. I know in line 17 there is, with the repetition of S, slow, slow. That's an example of alliteration. See if you can find any others. Also, when we look at sound, we're also talking about the rhyme. And of course, we spent a lot of time with rhyme because it also connects really with structure and form. And so I'm not going to go over that again. What is the difference between tone and mood? The last understanding poetry question is about mood. Here's the key. When we're talking about tone, it's the speaker's attitude. When we're talking about mood, we're talking about an overall feeling, really created through mostly the description of details and setting and evocation of mood. Mood and atmosphere are very closely aligned. Tone and mood, however, are not. They are very different. So those two, it's important to know and understand the difference between. There's links in the Understanding Poetry if you want to learn more about the difference between tone and mood or any of this other stuff. Good luck as you answer the questions about your poem for 4.5.